She was born a bargaining chip, but no one expected the pawn to outlive the kingmaker. In the frozen hinterlands of the far northeast, where the winds howl across pine-covered mountains and rivers crack like broken glass, a child was born to the Yehe clan, the seventh daughter in a house where girls were counted like coins. Her mother, veiled behind the fur drapery of a tent warmed by cedar embers, whispered prayers not for her beauty, but for her usefulness. It was a prayer of strategy, not sentiment, for in the world of Yurshan tribes, where bloodline meant leverage and daughters meant treaties, every birth was a political move written in flesh. The girl was given no name that history remembers, only a title she would earn in another man's court. Lady Yehe Nara. From her earliest years, she was taught not to cry too loudly, not to look too proudly, not to hold her chin so high that it might threaten a visiting elder's authority. She learned the weight of silence, the texture of manipulation, and the value of restraint. Her sisters braided her hair in patterns meant to signal fertility, loyalty, and discretion. But her eyes, sharp, almond-shaped, set just a little too far apart, were eyes that watched. She was not the strongest or the most beautiful, but she was the one who remembered everything. By the time she was 10, she could name every major tribe within the vast wilderness of Yurkin territory. She knew which had horses, which had muskets, which traded with the Ming Empire to the south. She knew her own Yehe tribe stood proud, but perilously alone. Their alliances were brittle, their wealth thin, and their elder council ruled with a nostalgia for a past long gone. Still, Yehe lands were considered a jewel in the crown of the Yurkin sphere. Rich forests, fast rivers, and the most coveted of all, daughters who could be married off like keys to locked doors. In another tent, some hundreds of miles away, a boy named Nurhaci watched his father and grandfather die in battle. They had been allied with the Ming, betrayed by another Yurshan clan, and left to rot on the battlefield. The boy was 14. By the time Lady Yehe Nara turned 11, Nurhaci was already gathering men. He wore no crown, claimed no title, but walked like a storm bound for the center of the world. She heard his name first in a whisper from her uncle. That son of Taxi, he's dangerous, but brilliant. To the Yehe elders, he was a curiosity, a minor chieftain with big ambitions, an upstart, a nothing. That would prove to be their first miscalculation. Years passed. Lady Yehe Nara bloomed into adolescence like a willow in ice. Quiet, graceful, but tensile. Her worth grew not through dowries or declarations, but through her unparalleled understanding of politics. She listened at the edges of every tent meeting, memorizing tribal disputes, mapping which families harbored grudges and which leaders drank too heavily. She knew before the elders did that Yehe's position was crumbling. The other Yurkin clans, Hada, Ula, Hoifa, were beginning to fall under Nurhaci's sway. He didn't just conquer them, he consumed them. Their warriors were absorbed into his growing army. Their languages were folded into his banner system. Their gods were rewritten in his favor. He created not just an army, but a new identity. The 8 Banners, a military social order that turned tribes into gears of a singular machine. By the time Lady Yehe Nara was 17, Nurhaci had become more than a threat. He was inevitability incarnate. The elders convened in secret sessions, fearful that Yehe would be next. Some proposed war, others proposed alliance, but there were no alliances left to make. And so, in the oldest tradition of survival, they chose a third path: surrender by marriage. The decision was made with clinical calculation. She would be sent to Nurhaci, not as a hostage but as a bride, a gesture of goodwill. An attempt to buy time. Lady Yehe Nara was not consulted. Her reaction was neither protest nor submission. She merely nodded, then returned to her quarters, where she sat for 2 hours in silence. The next morning she began memorizing everything she could about her future husband. He had 6 wives already, at least 10 sons. He wore armor made from iron-plated leather and spoke 3 dialects fluently. He had ordered the execution of his own cousin. He once fasted for a week to appease the river gods. He believed dreams were omens and that his bloodline had been chosen to restore the empire lost to the Yurkins centuries before. She committed these details to memory, And then she packed her things, not as a bride, but as a diplomat heading into enemy territory. Her arrival at Nurhaci's court was unceremonious. There were no choirs, no silk banners, just frost on the trees and the heavy eyes of women who had arrived before her. She entered the court as the Yehe bride, a nickname laced with suspicion. Everyone knew her tribe had resisted Nurhaci. Everyone knew she came not from loyalty, but from strategy. And Nurhaci himself, tall, dark-eyed, carved from the wilderness, like a statue of frozen intent, greeted her with the look of a man reading a message in code. "You carry your father's eyes," he said. It was the only sentence he offered her that day. She was placed in the third compound, neither highest nor lowest in rank. It was a quiet exile of sorts. There, Lady Yehe Nara began the second chapter of her life, the slow, silent war of influence. She made no overt moves. She praised her co-wives. She offered herbal remedies to guards with fevers. She observed the rhythms of the court and adapted without comment. When Nurhaci passed through her quarters, she bowed with perfect timing, never too low to suggest desperation, never too high to suggest arrogance. And then, after months of observation, she played her first card. She requested to see the administrative ledgers of the 8 banners. It was unprecedented. Wives, especially new ones from suspect tribes, did not ask to see state documents. But she cloaked the request in humility. "So that I may understand the world my lord has built." Nurhaci, intrigued more than insulted, allowed it. What she discovered within those documents was more than accounting. It was the blueprint of an empire in its infancy. She noticed inconsistencies in the supply lines, overpayments to certain clans, underreporting of iron shipments, and she knew something else. The Yehe had information that could solve some of those gaps. It was her first offer of value to Nurhaci, not through her body, but through her mind. He summoned her one evening, not to his bed, but to the war council tent. She stood among warriors and strategists, her breath fogging in the cold air, as she spoke of trade routes, tribute discrepancies, and how the Ula tribe could be turned with the right economic pressure. For a moment there was silence. Then Nurhaci laughed, not with mockery but recognition. "You do not speak like a wife," he said. "You speak like a governor." From that night she was no longer just the Yehe bride. She became an advisor in shadow. Her position was still delicate. The other wives saw her as a threat. The Yehe tribe saw her as a traitor. And Nurhaci, brilliant, ferocious, loyal to none but his vision, was as likely to reward devotion as he was to crush it. But Lady Yehe Nara had found her weapon: relevance. When her first child was born, a boy named Mangaltai, she understood the stakes had changed. Sons were power, sons were future, but sons also attracted enemies. She began grooming alliances within the court, not by favor, but by debt. A favor here, a cure there, a whispered warning about a disloyal cousin. She wrapped herself in usefulness. And as Nurhaci's power grew, his conquests expanding from tribes to fortress cities, so too did hers. Yet in the back of her mind she remembered the frozen faces of her Yehe elders. She remembered the night she left, the silence of her sisters, the sorrow in her mother's eyes. She told no one, but each year on the first snowfall, she burned a single pine branch in secret, an offering to the land that had sold her. What she could not know, what none of them could, was that one day Nurhaci would march on the Yehe. That one day she would be forced to choose between the dynasty she helped build and the blood that still ran cold in her veins. But for now she waited, like the willow. She bent, but did not break, and the empire, though it didn't yet know it, had found its silent queen. It was said that a good Yurkin wife bore children, braided peace into the household, and asked for nothing more than winter fur and spring honey. But Lady Yehe Nara had never been a good Yurkin wife. She was a foreign body in Nurhaci's bloodstream, tolerated, perhaps admired, but never truly embraced. No amount of obedience could erase the lineage inked into her bones. She was Yehe by birth and by memory. And though her hands now poured tea into the mouth of the man who would one day become emperor, her heart moved elsewhere. back to snow-buried forests and fire-warm councils, to the tribe that had traded her away. The court she now inhabited was no less political than the one she had left, only better armed. Nurhaci's compound was a living organism, warriors trained with iron-tipped spears, while bureaucrats scribbled furiously beside pots of steaming ink. Shamans chanted beneath banners dyed in blood. Concubines whispered in corners. Sons played at sword fights with the weight of dynasties behind every strike, and Lady Yehe Nara moved among them like breath through silk, unseen yet present. She knew when to smile, when to recede, and when to offer counsel wrapped in domestic metaphor. If a supply line failed, she'd suggest a stronger cord for winter clothes. If a rival concubine rose too quickly, she'd quietly present a rare herb, harmless, but known to cause mild skin eruptions. Nothing criminal, everything calculated. She had not expected to become valuable. That was her first mistake. Within 2 years of her arrival, Nurhaci began inviting her to more than just court ceremonies. He summoned her for private counsel, though not always in his bed. Sometimes it was late at night, with maps spread across his war table. Other times it was at dawn, beneath the pale mist rising from the riverbank, where he would speak in fragments about dreams, vengeance, the old emperors of the Yurkan past. He asked her once, "Do you believe in reincarnation?" She answered with a question, "Do you believe dynasties are born or built?" He never answered. Still their bond grew, not romantic, not familial, but something sharper. Two tacticians orbiting the same impossible ambition. She knew better than to confuse trust with affection. Nurhaci didn't love his wives. He used them. And yet, in this strange architecture of politics and survival, Lady Yehe Nara had become indispensable. But indispensability had its price. As Nurhaci continued his ruthless consolidation of Yurkan tribes, resistance hardened in pockets across the north. The Yehe, her own people, remained one of the last independent tribes. They had fortified their borders, appealed to the Ming for aid, and most insultingly, begun negotiating marriage alliances with Nurhaci's enemies. She heard of this not through official channels, but in hushed voices among the concubines. They said her brother was leading the resistance, that he had called her a traitor bride. Lady Yehe Nara said nothing, but that night she could not sleep. She sat on her veranda staring into the wind-lashed pine trees and wondered if one could betray something that had already abandoned her. Her marriage had never been a choice. Her loyalty, perhaps, was. She asked for an audience with Nurhaci. It was granted. He stood in his war tent, arms folded, staring at a banner of Yehe colors nailed to a pole. It had been captured in a skirmish, and blood still stained its fringes. "You've heard," and he said. "I've heard many things," she replied. He looked at her, not as a husband, but as a warlord. "They defy me. They protect themselves," she said carefully, "as all tribes do when cornered. You're defending them. I'm explaining them." There was silence. Then he said, "They sent a bride to me once. I accepted her. I gave her a place. I gave her children." Lady Yehe Nara stood tall. "And now you will use her as proof of their treachery." Nurhaci's eyes narrowed. "I will use her to prove their weakness." She knew then what was coming. Not in a week or a month, but soon. The Yehe would be made an example, and she would be his shield, his trophy, his evidence that even resistance bore children in his name. She left the tent that night colder than the wind. In the weeks that followed, her position within the court shifted. She was moved to a more prominent residence, larger, warmer, lined with furs and guards. Her son Mangaltai was given additional tutors. Her servants were increased, but she knew better than to see it as favor. It was containment. She was being staged, prepared, dressed for the play in which she had no lines. Meanwhile, the court buzzed with war preparations. Nurhaci had begun drafting what would become his most famous political document, the Seven Grievances, a formal declaration of reasons for rebellion against the Ming. But beneath its rhetoric lay a deeper strategy. Eliminate internal dissent to solidify external war. The Yehe stood in the way of both. As spring thawed the last of the snow, Nurhaci's army assembled like a tidal wave in iron. Banners of all colors fluttered, blue, red, yellow, and white. Each represented a segment of his eight-banner system, unified, disciplined, merciless. Lady Yehe Nara did not ride with them. She remained at court, dressed in mourning gray, as if anticipating death that hadn't yet arrived. In truth, she had sent secret messages, through old servants, through healers and market vendors, to warn her people. She offered no military secrets, only this: do not resist, retreat, hide, survive. Whether they listened or not, she would never know. The campaign lasted only weeks. The Yehe were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and psychologically unprepared to face a warlord who now fought with an empire's precision. Their resistance collapsed, their elders captured, their cities burned. When Nurhaci returned victorious, he presented her with a gift, a golden comb, once belonging to her mother, taken from the ruins of the Yehe capital. He handed it to her with the same hands that had ordered its theft. She accepted it, and in doing so, buried a part of herself that would never be resurrected. Whispers followed in the months after the Yehe's fall. Some claimed she had betrayed them. Others said she had saved what few survivors remained by softening Nurhaci's wrath. Both might have been true. Neither mattered now. She was no longer a Yehe daughter. She was a Yershan queen, but she had earned her crown in ashes. From then on, she wore only muted colors, never the reds of celebration, never the whites of rebirth. She walked slowly through the halls, and when people bowed, she did not nod in return. Her son grew strong, as did her influence. But something in her gaze changed. It no longer sought alliances. It recorded, remembered. She knew that history would forget her, that her name would be listed among many consorts, that when the Qing dynasty rose from Nurhaci's bones, the scribes would write of battles, sons, banners, but not of her silence. Not of the pain that came from being both mother to a dynasty and mourner to a dead world. But if history would forget, she would not. She would watch. She would guide. And when the next wife stepped too close to power, she would whisper reminders, not of vengeance, but of survival. She had married the enemy, and now she ruled beside him, not through love, but through endurance. Because sometimes the willow does not fall to the axe, it grows around it. Power never sleeps in silence. It hums behind smiles, coils beneath loyalty, and waits, patient, behind bloodlines. In Nurhaci's court, as his banners multiplied and his soldiers thundered down the Ming borders, the greater war was no longer with the enemy outside, but with the shadows gathering within his own house. Lady Yehe Nara knew this intimately. She had survived the fall of her tribe, the betrayal of her kin, and the crucible of court suspicion. But as Nurhaci's power grew to the edges of legend, so too did the hunger of those closest to him. His wives, once cloaked in demure smiles, began to sharpen their tongues in silk. His sons, born of different mothers, no longer played in the courtyards as brothers, but as rivals rehearsing war. It was the season of quiet knives. The court, now firmly established in Mukden, was a fortress of marble, ritual, and ambition. Nurhaci's 8 banners formed the backbone of a nation in motion: soldiers who were farmers, farmers who were priests, priests who carried swords. His campaigns against the Ming grew bolder, testing the gates of Liaodong and rattling the porcelain heart of the Southern Empire. But at home, something more dangerous festered: succession. There were too many sons, too many wives, too many factions whispering in separate tents. And Lady Yehe Nara was at the center of it all. Her son Mangultai had matured into a warrior of promise, disciplined, charming, and widely respected among the banner officers. Some called him the Golden Branch, a child of noble blood from both mother and father. He had the Yehe intelligence, the Nurhaci ferocity, and the calm silence of a boy raised by a mother who had mastered survival. He was not the eldest, nor the strongest, but he was dangerously capable. That made him a target. The eldest son, Qing, born of another consort, had once been heir apparent. But his pride had soured into cruelty. There were stories of unjust punishments, bribes collected in secret, even rumors of plotting against his own brothers. Nurhaci, despite his love for Qing, had begun to withhold his trust. The tension between father and son became a rift in the sky itself. thunderclouds on every face at court. Meanwhile, another son, Daishan, had risen in quiet efficiency. Pragmatic, cold, and politically agile, he gained the favor of many advisors who feared Quyen's instability. Behind him lurked Abahai, a consort younger and more ambitious than most, whose son, Hong Taiji, was being groomed like a blade waiting to be unsheathed. The balance within the palace shifted daily. Lady Yehe Nara did not declare her son's candidacy for succession. That would have been suicide. Instead, she did what she had always done. She observed. She remembered who visited whom after dark. She tracked which eunuchs were replaced suddenly. She noted which generals began sending gifts not to Nurhaci, but to other mothers. One night during the Lantern Festival, she watched as Daishan whispered to a guest general near the lotus pond. Behind them, Hong Taiji lit a floating lantern, then pushed it downstream before anyone else. It glowed brighter than the others. That was no accident. Later that month, a minor scandal broke. A ledger disappeared from the War Office, only to reappear with discrepancies. No culprit was named, but Quyen's household was placed under temporary observation. Two of his allies were reassigned to distant provinces. It was not discipline, it was exile. Nurhaci said little, but in his silence the court heard thunder. Lady Yehe Nara understood the message. Nurhaci no longer trusted Quyen. The eldest son had stumbled, and when the tiger doubted his own cub, others began to circle. The court wives reacted in their own ways. Some doubled down, sending gifts, organizing feasts, offering prayers in Nurhaci's name. Others pulled back, shielding their sons behind rituals and excuses. But Lady Yehe Nara remained perfectly still. She knew the winds would change again. In this vortex of ambition, she found herself reevaluating her own place in the story. She had long since stopped believing in fairy tale love or motherly reward. Her husband, now entering his 60s, no longer needed companionship, only loyalty. Her son, no longer a boy, would soon decide whether to stand still or draw blood. And she, forever the outsider, forever the Yehe bride, walked between futures like a ghost seeking form. Then came the illness. It began with a low fever in a junior wife, then another. Then servants began coughing blood. The court's physicians declared it a winter plague, though privately they suspected poisoning. Nurhaci, furious, sealed the lower compounds. Visitors were restricted. The wives were locked in, not for their safety, but for containment. Lady Yehe Nara remained untouched. Whether by fortune or by someone's careful mercy, her compound was not infected. Still, she used the moment not to plead, but to maneuver. She sent herbal packages to the other wives. She prayed in full view of the guards. She invited one of Nurhaci's more respected generals to visit her shrine and offer incense for his ill cousin. These acts were not generosity, they were messages. "I am not your enemy," they said. And it worked. When the sickness passed, two things had changed. The infection was blamed on Quyen's household, and Lady Yehe Nara was seen not as a bystander, but as a stabilizing force. That was when Nurhaci invited her to the fire tent. This tent was no ordinary court chamber. It was where he made decisions history would record. Declarations of war, stripping of titles, redesign of banners. Few women were ever summoned there. Inside, the fire crackled low, casting long shadows on the painted hides that lined the walls. Nurhaci, older now, his beard streaked with gray, stared into the flames as if seeking answers from ancestors. He did not greet her. He simply said, "They are tearing each other apart." She waited. "They are too many, and none of them are ready." Still, she said nothing. Finally, he looked at her. His eyes, dark as a storm-lit lake, searched hers. Not for love, but for clarity. "What would you do," he asked, "if you were me?" And for a moment, the tent was silent, but for the crackling wood. Then she said, "I would give them all a taste of rule, not to see who is most eager, but who is most afraid of losing it." Nurhaci's gaze did not waver, and then, just barely, he smiled. Weeks later, a strange decree was issued. 4 sons, Quyen, Daishan, Mangaltai, and Hong Taiji, were granted shared military leadership over a new campaign against the Ming garrisons. It was a test, a trap, a battlefield experiment disguised as glory. Lady Yehe Nara watched them ride out together, four brothers who no longer shared anything but ambition. She wondered which would return, and which would be buried by pride. When news came of their victory, the court erupted in celebration. But the subtext was clearer than fireworks. Qing had faltered. His troops were late, his strategy flawed, his behavior erratic. In his absence, Nurhaci removed his name from the line of succession. The house was now fully divided, and from its splinters, a new power would rise. Lady Yehe Nara, seated beneath her willow in the courtyard, lit a stick of incense and offered it to the wind. Not for peace, not for forgiveness, but for clarity. Because in this house, built on conquest, ruled by sons of ambition and women of memory, the war was not over, it was only changing shape. History rarely waits for justice. It waits for justification. In the spring of 1618, as rivers melted and soldiers cleaned rust from their blades, Nurhaci unveiled a document that would ignite an empire. The 7 Grievances. It was more than a manifesto. It was a carefully sharpened dagger pointed at the heart of the Ming Dynasty. And though its ink bore Nurhaci's hand, its shadows were lined with the quiet fingerprints of many. Among them, Lady Yehe Nara. But she did not write with words. She wrote in withheld advice, in the silences she allowed to bloom, in the measured nods she gave when vengeance became strategy. Because by then, she understood something dangerous. The future would be forged not by the boldest warriors, but by the ones who knew when to let the flames rise. The document itself read like a litany of personal slights. Nurhaci accused the Ming court of harboring his enemies, of executing his father and grandfather unjustly, of favoring unworthy Yurkin chiefs, of breaking promises, of interfering in tribal affairs, and of dishonoring sacred treaties. 7 reasons, each carved from past wounds, sewn into the cloak of destiny. Lady Yehe Nara read them carefully. The document was not just a statement of rebellion, it was an invitation to war under the guise of righteousness, a message to the Yurchen people that their vengeance was divine, that the banners they marched under were not symbols of conquest but of cosmic correction. And yet, beneath its righteous tone, she saw the truth. It was also a trap. For once the grievances were made public, Nurhaci could never turn back. He was not merely a tribal warlord anymore. He was a man declaring the collapse of heaven's order and offering himself as its new architect. The court was split. Some cheered, others whispered behind lacquered screens. A few warned caution, but none dared speak too loudly. The moment the grievances were read aloud in the fire tent, the tone of the court changed. Drums beat harder. Armies drilled longer. Messengers galloped across the north like sparks lighting dry kindling. War had begun, not just against the Ming, but against the inertia of fear that had gripped the Yurchen for generations. Lady Yehe Nara watched as preparations engulfed Mukden. Armor was reforged. Horses were shod. Maps were rolled and unrolled like scrolls of prophecy. The sons of Nurhaci moved through the palace with new urgency. Daishan reviewed troop formations. Mangaltai, her son, oversaw weapons procurement with icy precision. And Hong Taiji? He met with scholars, quietly commissioning translations of Chinese texts, perhaps already imagining a future not just won by war, but shaped by culture. But even as the wheels of history turned, something else stirred, something less visible. Fear. It came not from the battlefield, but from within. Nurhaci, now aging and surrounded by sons who no longer obeyed blindly, began seeing shadows in every chamber. His paranoia was not madness, it was memory. He remembered how quickly loyalty could rot. He had risen by devouring the fractured Yurchen leadership. He knew the same fate awaited him, should he stumble. So he struck first. In the weeks following the publication of the grievances, 3 minor officials were executed for treasonous hesitation. 2 were caught in contradictory reports. One had simply failed to clap loudly enough after a military proclamation. Their deaths were not for justice. They were offerings, to remind the court that unity was no longer optional. Lady Yehe Nara said nothing. She lit incense for the dead, then ensured her servants did not. She understood that the grievances were not just declarations of war. They were mirrors. They reflected what each person in the court feared most. For some, it was external enemies. For others, it was being seen as disloyal. For her, it was what the war would make of her son. Mangaltai had grown into a soldier with the mind of a statesman. He did not rush into battles. He calculated. And Lady Yehe Nara feared that calculation would be mistaken for ambition. In a court like theirs, clarity was rarely rewarded. Obscurity was safer. She advised him, as always, not with commands but questions. Why must a tree always reach higher, she once asked him. What if it grows stronger by thickening its roots? He did not answer. But weeks later, he began to defer more often to Daishan in public settings. A signal, a retreat, a survival. And yet, even as the internal theater played its quiet scenes, the external war erupted. The first campaign launched against the Ming outposts along the border. Nurhaci personally led 20,000 troops across the Liaodong frontier, capturing fortress after fortress with brutal efficiency. The Ming commanders, entrenched in bureaucracy and drained by corruption, underestimated the speed and coordination of Nurhaci's 8-banner system. Cities fell like dominoes. Prisoners were offered clemency, then conscripted. Civilians were spared, then taxed. But not all were victories. At Fushan, the resistance was fierce. A battle that was meant to last a day dragged into 4. Lady Yehe Nara heard the reports like echoes from a distant room. Casualty numbers, supply shortages, weather complications. And somewhere among them, the death of a childhood friend's son, a boy she once shared fruit with under the pine trees of Yehe territory, now burned in the name of grievances she had never written. That night she woke from sleep, drenched in sweat, her hands clenched as if gripping a sword. But she had no sword, only memory. As victories stacked, Nurhaci declared himself Khan of the later Qin, a direct reference to the ancient Yurshan Qin dynasty that had once ruled northern China. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. He was no longer just a tribal leader. He was emperor in all but name. Lady Yehe Nara was given a new title, Da Fujin, Great Lady or Primary Consort. But the title came not with joy, only weight. With it came the expectation to represent unity in a house already splintered. And then came the moment that would fracture her further. A group of Yehe prisoners were paraded through the court, captured fighters who had resisted during the early campaigns. Among them was a woman, her face burned, her gaze unbroken. She stared at Lady Yehe Nara as if she could see through every layer of silk and decorum. Lady Yehe Nara recognized her instantly. A cousin, once a friend, now a prisoner. Nurhaci offered the gesture of mercy. Choose one, he said, to be spared. She hesitated for only a moment, long enough for everyone to notice. Then she pointed, not at her cousin, but at a child in the back of the line. Later that night, she sat alone, holding a slip of cloth torn from the prisoner's robe. On it, a single word had been sewn by hand. Remember. She did, and yet she remained. She remained because empires are not shaped by those who run from their past, but by those who carry it like a blade between their ribs. The 7 grievances had changed everything. They had justified war. They had unified tribes. They had built a nation from ashes. But for Lady Yehe Nara, they had done something else. They had buried her name, her tribe, and her former self beneath a history that would never tell her story. So she told it in silence. In every alliance she brokered, in every son she guided, in every rival she protected or condemned. Because the true grievances are never written on scrolls. They live behind the eyes of the survivors. A tree does not scream when it is cut down. It only burns louder when turned to ash. Lady Yehe Nara had long lived with the knowledge that her homeland would one day fall. It was a truth she buried beneath years of careful loyalty, of measured steps, of children raised in silence. But knowing is not the same as witnessing. When the flames finally came for Yehe, it was not the sound that broke her. It was the color, the red of burning pine, the gray of smoke curling upward like ancestral prayers. And worst of all, the white of surrender flags, lowered too late to matter. The campaign began with whispers, messengers reporting skirmishes near Yehe territory, traders claiming the Yehe had refused a diplomatic envoy, rumors that the Ming had sent arms to Lady Yehe Nara's kin. At first, she dismissed them as posturing, provocations meant to unnerve her. But then came the order from Nurhaci himself, a full military campaign against the Yehe tribe. There was no ceremony, no council meeting, no performance of justification, just a sentence. They had their chance. She could not sleep that night. The wind through the paper walls of her chamber sounded like old women crying. She sat beneath the hanging scrolls of her compound, scrolls that once told stories of spring festivals and mountain hunts. But now she saw only warnings. In her mind, she retraced every branch of her family tree, counting the cousins who still lived, the uncles too proud to kneel, the children who would never understand why the empire's queen had not stopped the sword. She considered pleading. She considered standing before the court and demanding mercy, but that would only seal their fate faster. Nurhaci was not a man softened by sentiment, not anymore. The grievances had remade him. He believed in destiny now, not diplomacy. And she, the woman he had once called wise beyond her years, would be nothing more than a mirror reflecting hesitation. So she did nothing. It was the most violent nothing of her life. The army that marched was led by Daishan and Mangultai, her own son. She wondered if Nurhaci had done that deliberately to test his loyalty. She knew Mangultai would not disobey. He was too well trained, too aware of what disobedience cost. Before he left, he came to her chambers. He stood in full armor, his hair tied tightly, a red sash across his chest. For a moment, she saw the child he once was, crying over a scraped knee, asking why the other boys mocked him for having a mother from a conquered tribe. Now he was a man, marching to conquer the very people who had birthed him through her blood. He did not ask for her permission, only her eyes, and she gave them to him, steady, unreadable, unblinking. When he bowed and turned to go, she did not call him back. She did not pray. She waited. The siege lasted less than a week. The Yehe, proud and isolated, had fortified their mountain strongholds but lacked the numbers, the weapons, and most of all, the belief that victory was possible. They still hoped for mercy. They had not yet accepted that the world they knew was gone. On the sixth day, fire rained from the ridgelines. It wasn't just villages, it was shrines, burial grounds, ancestral trees, symbols. Nurhaci didn't just want to win, he wanted the idea of Yehe erased. Lady Yehe Nara received no reports, only silence. The court fell into a strange calm, as if holding its breath. The other wives avoided her. Some out of pity, some out of fear. Servants carried trays with eyes averted. Even the palace dogs barked less. When the soldiers returned, Mukden rang with celebration. Trumpets, feasts, ceremonial drums. Nurhaci declared it a turning point, the final consolidation of the Yurkan tribes. Now they were one people, one banner, one voice, but not one heart. Mangultai returned last. His face was as it had always been, neutral, disciplined, clean. But Lady Yehe Nara saw the change, not in his eyes, but in the way he removed his boots, as if they still held pieces of what he had walked through. He said nothing of what he had seen, not the women who begged, not the children who hid beneath floorboards, not the old warriors who refused to die by fire and instead charged arrows with empty hands. Instead, he placed a small bundle on her table, wrapped in cloth. When she opened it, she found a carved ivory hairpin, one she had last seen in her cousin's hair 20 years earlier. She did not ask how he had found it. She only placed it beside her incense altar and lit no candle that night. The fire in Yehe did not stop at the borders. It spread inward, through her memories, through the court, through the walls of her own identity. The Yehe were gone, and with them, the last tether to a version of herself that had once believed in return. Now she was only the empire's wife. In the weeks that followed, the court reorganized. Titles were redistributed. Lands once claimed by Yehe elders were reassigned to new bannermen. Nurhaci gifted ceremonial robes to his generals and praised Mangultai for unflinching loyalty. Her son bowed at the ceremony, accepting the praise with a stillness that terrified her. That night she spoke to him for the first time since his return. "Do you dream?" she asked. He paused. "Sometimes," he said. "What do you see?" He looked at her, then away. "Smoke." She nodded, then said, "Breathe deeper." The next morning, she sent an anonymous donation to a distant temple. Incense, rice, and 1,000 strands of willow fiber. The message was simple: let memory persist even in silence. But in court, she resumed her role. She hosted seasonal banquets, oversaw the education of younger concubines, advised the stewards on palace maintenance, and all the while she watched. She watched Hong Taiji grow sharper in speech and more fluent in Chinese customs. She watched Abahai, his mother, sow alliances with scholars and military clerks alike. She watched Nurhaci sleep less, eat less, trust less. The fire in Yehe had not ended a war. It had fed a new one, a quiet one of sons and wives and ghosts. And as Lady Yehe Nara moved through the palace corridors, she no longer wondered if history would remember her tribe. She wondered if it would ever remember who lit the first flame. History remembers emperors. It remembers the banners they raised, the cities they conquered, the laws they engraved in bronze. But the mothers of those emperors? They are remembered only by the shadows they cast, faint, quiet, persistent. Lady Yehe Nara had become one of those shadows, and it was in shadow that she thrived, with the Yehe tribe reduced to ash and silence. Her identity as a political figure, once tied to marriage alliances and diplomacy, had transformed into something quieter but far more dangerous. She was now the mother of a prince with a legitimate claim to succession. That alone in Nurhaci's court was a form of warfare. Mangaltai had returned from the campaign against the Yehe not just as a general, but as a potential heir. His military success, his calm intellect, and his mother's rank as Dafujin made him one of the most qualified candidates to follow in Nurhaci's path. But qualification in the imperial court meant nothing without orchestration, and orchestration was precisely what Lady Yehe Nara excelled at. She did not campaign for her son. She did not elevate his name in public. Instead, she buried him in humility. While the court fawned over Hong Taiji's growing eloquence and Daishin's administrative control, Lady Yehe Nara subtly ensured that Mangaltai was seen as dutiful, loyal, and disinterested in personal glory. When a visiting noble praised Mangaltai at a banquet, she redirected the conversation to the general's marriage. When rumors swirled about Nurhaci's waning strength, she reminded her son, behind closed doors, heirs are born from patience, not prophecy. But she was not the only mother with ambition. Abahai, favored by Nurhaci and mother to Hong Taiji, had grown bold. Once quiet and observant, she now hosted her own audiences, arranged intellectual salons with Confucian scholars, and even orchestrated marriages between her cousins and high-ranking officials. She moved like someone who had already seen the throne in her dreams and now walked toward it. The palace became a chessboard of silken eyes. The older wives, forgotten by time, held small pockets of influence in the harem. Some leaned toward Daishin, hoping his administrative sense would preserve their pensions. Others whispered about Kuyen's return, despite his disgrace. But Lady Yehe Nara knew better than to rely on nostalgia or tradition. She knew the war would be won, not in council halls or battlefields, but in the quiet decisions of servants, scribes, and stewards. So she acted where no one was watching. She funded the restoration of a forgotten shrine in the southern garden, one dedicated to the ancestors of the 8 banners. She ensured the name of Mangaltai's grandfather was carved prominently into its plaque. She invited banner captains to offer incense with her during midwinter, subtly tying her son's legacy to the very origins of Nurhaci's dynasty. And it worked. Whispers changed. Now, Mangaltai was not just a warrior. He was a continuation. But with elevation came risk. One afternoon, a servant in her compound collapsed, frothing at the mouth. Poison, intended for Mangaltai. It was placed in a ceremonial teacup. The court never found the culprit. The physicians declared it a seasonal herb misused. But Lady Yehe Nara knew better. That night she burned every scroll in her chamber that bore the Yehe sigil. Not out of grief, but out of clarity. The game had begun in earnest. Mangultai, shaken by the incident, requested permission to take command of a frontier garrison for 6 months. He claimed it was to study the rotation of border troops, but she knew it was exile disguised as duty, a move to avoid the boiling tension in Mukden. She did not argue. She only sent him with 3 loyal men and a winter cloak sewn with layers of hidden armor. While her son disappeared beyond the snowed hills, the court moved faster. Nurhaci, aging rapidly, became more volatile. He shifted appointments, canceled rituals, accused ministers of incompetence, and issued contradictory orders. The cracks of his mortality widened with every passing week. Some said he was haunted by dreams of fire. Others said he saw his dead cousin in the mirror. Lady Yehe Nara saw something different. She saw a man terrified of legacy. He had built a nation from splintered tribes, forged banners from broken oaths, defied an empire, but he had not named a successor. And worse, he had too many sons, each more ambitious than the last. In the absence of a declaration, the palace filled the void with tension. Smiles grew sharper. Banquets became tests. Every glance carried a question. Whose son will inherit the storm? Abahai, sensing Nurhaci's decline, increased her presence at court. She appeared beside him at ancestor offerings. She read aloud Confucian texts in the palace library, acts of refinement, of virtue. And always Hong Taiji followed her steps like a shadow, learning to cast its own. Lady Yehe Nara did not compete. She watched. She let the spotlight burn on others, knowing its light also revealed flaws. But privately, she prepared. She revised Mangultai's alliances. She arranged marriages for distant cousins. She commissioned a genealogy scroll that emphasized her son's bloodline tracing to both Yehe and Isinjoro nobility. And most critically, she began gathering records, discreetly copied documents of court edicts, troop allocations, grain records, proof of her family's competence should it ever be questioned. She had become more than a mother. She had become an archivist of power. One evening during the autumn harvest ritual, Nurhaci stumbled. His knees gave way beneath the ancestral altar. Courtiers rushed to help, but he waved them off. In that moment, all eyes turned not to him, but to his sons. Who would step forward? Daishan moved first, catching his father by the arm. Hong Taiji stood still, eyes scanning the crowd. Mengultai, absent on the frontier, could not act. Later that night, rumors circled like vultures. Some claimed Nurhaci had whispered Daishan's name. Others swore he had said nothing. Abahai ordered more guards for her son's quarters. One of the minor wives fled the palace, fearing assassination. Lady Yehe Nara, meanwhile, stood before the ancestral altar and placed a single plum blossom in the incense bowl. Not as a prayer, but as a marker. Time had shifted. The next day, she received word. Mangultai had repelled a surprise Ming raid on the border with minimal losses. His leadership was praised in military dispatches. His men spoke of discipline, fairness, and unshakable calm. It was a quiet triumph, and perhaps the most dangerous one of all. She folded the dispatch into her robe and smiled. Because in the chaos of princes, sometimes the silent branch bears the most fruit. Some battles are won with steel, others are won before the first sword is ever drawn. In the spring of 1619, as the mountain ice thawed and the rivers once again found their voice, the Ming Empire made its most fateful mistake. It tried to crush Nurhaci with overwhelming force. 4 armies, 45,000 men, a full campaign coordinated across the northeastern frontier. It was the might of a crumbling empire clinging to the illusion of dominance. To the Ming, it was a necessary measure. To Nurhaci, it was destiny. To Lady Yehe Nara, it was a storm she had long foreseen. The campaign would be remembered as the Battle of Sarhu, a clash not merely of armies, but of worlds. And within it, as swords clashed and flags burned, the quiet calculations of one woman would help steer the very tide of history. It began with movement, scouts arriving breathless in Mukden, reporting the advance of Ming troops from 4 directions. A pincer formation, meant to converge on Nurhaci's capital and collapsed the fragile web of his newly unified banners. But the Ming, in their pride, had misunderstood something fundamental. They saw tribes. Nurhaci had built a nation. Within hours of confirmation, the 8 banners mobilized. Not in chaos, but in coordination. Each banner knew its route, each general his command. Horses were readied, arrows fletched, armor inspected for weak links. And above it all, the black gold standard of the later Qin rose against the sky like a prophecy come alive. Mangaltai, recalled from the frontier, arrived in the dead of night. Lady Yehe Nara met him not with embrace, but with instruction. "You do not ride to win," she told him. "You ride to survive. Victory belongs to the last man standing in court, not on the battlefield." He nodded, he understood. But war does not wait for caution. The 4 Ming armies moved in like tides, one from the east, one from the north, one across the mountains, one through the valleys. They expected division. They expected tribal confusion. Instead, they met ambushes, decoys, and terrain turned traitor. Sarhu was not a battlefield. It was a trap. Nurhaci, leading from the front as always, split his forces with surgical precision. He allowed 1 Ming column to advance deep, then cut off their supply lines and slaughtered them in a mountain pass. Another army, slowed by muddy roads, was drawn into a ravine where archers picked them apart from the trees. The remaining 2 collapsed in disarray, their commanders captured, their foot soldiers retreating into the forest with no banners, no orders, and no hope. It was not merely a victory, it was an extinction event for Ming authority in the north. When the news arrived in Mukden, the court erupted. Not in cheers, but in silence. It was too much, too fast, too perfect. Even the most seasoned ministers struggled to understand the scale of what had just happened. In a matter of days, a warlord had humbled an empire. Nurhaci returned to the capital draped in smoke and praise. He entered the city not like a king, but like a god, and beside him rode his sons. Daishan, calm and calculating. Mangaltai, blood-stained but unbroken. And Hong Taiji, radiant with the knowledge that history now bent at his feet. But if the streets were lined with applause, the palace was lined with new danger. Lady Yehe Nara watched the victory unfold like a dance of knives. She read the court poems extolling Nurhaci as the heaven-chosen ruler. She saw the new monuments erected overnight. She attended the ceremonial feast where generals laughed a little too loudly and drank a little too long. She saw the pride, the ambition, the opportunity, and she saw who moved first. Abahai, already emboldened by her son's rising fame, began building her network faster than ever. She organized poetry readings for court ladies and scholars. She commissioned murals of the campaign that subtly emphasized Hong Taiji's presence in key moments. She invited Daishan's wife to tea and gifted her a rare set of scrolls, painted with scenes of maternal virtue and political wisdom. Lady Yehe Nara made no such moves. Instead, she turned inward. She sent Mangaltai away, not to war, but to administer grain distribution in the flood-prone regions along the southern border, a dull, bureaucratic assignment, the kind that kept a prince alive. She knew the court was not ready to choose a successor, not yet, but it was ready to eliminate one, so she removed him from sight. Let them forget, she thought. Let them underestimate. While others sharpened blades, she sharpened records. She commissioned copies of every campaign report from Sarhu. Not the official ones, but the field notes, the private correspondences, the messenger's logs. From these she compiled a hidden archive, a narrative not of glory, but of logistics. Who ordered what? Who delayed? Who disobeyed? Who truly led? It was her insurance, her leverage. Meanwhile, Nurhaci, flushed with victory, began speaking openly of expansion. "China is not invincible," he declared during one council. "Their walls are paper, their swords are ceremonial. We will tear their names from our land." The court nodded, but Lady Yehe Nara saw the price. The Ming were wounded, but not dead, and a wounded beast is more dangerous than a healthy one. Worse, Nurhaci's own body had begun to betray him. He coughed more often, slept less, grew thinner. His dreams became erratic. He demanded new palaces, larger drums, more elaborate rituals. He ordered the creation of a written script for the Yurchen language, an ambitious project that consumed scholars and scribes for months. Lady Yehe Nara visited the scribes once. She did not ask about letters. She asked who paid for the ink. The answer revealed a pattern: resources diverted, taxes rerouted, favoritism masked as reform. She filed it away. Because Sarhu had changed more than the map, it had changed the balance. Nurhaci was no longer the hungry upstart. He was now the aging founder. And founders, she knew, eventually become memories, used by those who follow to justify everything they do. She began preparing for his death, not with mourning, but with survival. One night, as rain lashed the palace walls and thunder cracked like old bone, Lady Yehe Nara walked alone through the southern garden. The willows she had planted years ago now towered overhead, their branches whispering in the wind. She stood beneath them, closed her eyes, and whispered a single line from an old Yehe poem. "Let the storm take the roof. My roots are deeper than stone." Sarhu had proven Nurhaci's supremacy, but it had also proven something else: that war could be planned, that destiny could be shaped, and that even in victory, the most dangerous game had only just begun. The world forgets that empires are not born in coronations. They are born in silence, behind curtained windows, beneath incense smoke, between a father and his many sons. In the years following the Battle of Sarhu, Nurhaci's empire swelled like lungs filled with mountain air. The Ming dynasty, humiliated, receded from its northeastern borders, and for the first time in centuries, the Yurchen tribes stood not as broken shards but as a single blade, sharp, gleaming, and waiting for the next strike. But beneath that unity, the question of succession grew like rot in golden fruit. Nurhaci was still strong in name, still feared in the field, still revered in the ancestral rites. But those closest to him saw what others didn't. His steps had grown slower, his appetite thinner. His eyes wandered in meetings, and sometimes he spoke of old battles as if they were still being fought. In private, some called it age. In whispers, some called it decline. But in the minds of his sons, it meant opportunity. Lady Yehe Nara had expected this. She had prepared for it. For years, she had shielded her son, Mangaltai, from the rising heat of ambition, keeping him just visible enough to be remembered, but just quiet enough to be overlooked by rivals. It had worked. He was trusted. He was respected. But he was not feared. And yet now, as Nurhaci's days grew uncertain, the succession could no longer be avoided. The court had no law for it, no written testament, no imperial edict naming an heir. In the Yurchen tradition, power passed to the worthy, not necessarily to the eldest. It was a system meant to reward strength, but in a palace brimming with strong sons, it guaranteed only one thing: conflict. There were 4 names whispered in the corridors of Mukden: Daishan, the eldest surviving son, efficient and politically astute; Mangaltai, Lady Yehe Nara's son, disciplined and balanced; Amin, impetuous and bold, beloved by cavalrymen; and Hong Taiji, youngest of the 4, but sharpest in mind and tongue. All had fought in the Sarhu, all had led men, all had spilled blood, but only one could wear the crown that did not yet exist. Lady Yehe Nara observed the tension as one might observe the changing wind, not with panic, but with calculation. This was not a storm she could stop, only one she could outlast. Abahai, ever more visible in court, continued to position her son, Hong Taiji, as the natural successor. She flattered ministers, arranged philosophical readings in the palace gardens, and filled the court with the scent of refinement and destiny. Hong Taiji mirrored her rhythm. He translated Chinese classics into Yurchen, praised Confucian harmony, and spoke of governance as if already enthroned. Daishan, less poetic, focused on alliances. He controlled supply chains, military pay, court appointments. Quiet power, the kind that needed no trumpet. And Mangaltai, he remained the most enigmatic. Lady Yehe Nara had ensured he kept his role as administrator of the southern provinces. Far from the court's claws, close to the empire's breadbasket, grain meant leverage, and he had plenty of both. But when Nurhaci fell ill, genuinely this time, everything changed. It was not a single illness, but a wave of them, a fever that returned each month, a wound that would not heal, confusion during rituals. His physicians lied in public, but sweat in private. The patriarch of the Jin state was unraveling before their eyes, and the court responded like a hive struck by stone. Appointments were made and unmade, marriages were rushed, fortunes shifted with the placement of a teacup. Everyone waited for the announcement that never came, the name of a successor. Nurhaci said nothing. He retreated from daily governance, delegating authority to his sons, but never in equal measure. One day, Ammon would receive a treasury order. The next, Daishan would be granted a military review. Then Hong Taiji would be tasked with overseeing the temple renovations. It was as if he were feeding each son just enough hope to keep them still, but not enough to crown any of them. Lady Yehe Nara understood the tactic. It was not favoritism, it was survival. Even in weakness, Nurhaci ruled through division, but division had consequences. Without clarity, factions hardened. The 8 banners, once symbols of unity, began to lean toward different princes. Officers held private feasts, generals met in secret. The court became a quiet war, and when men are forced to choose between future kings, they prepare for present battles. Lady Yehe Nara remained silent. She knew speaking would invite counterblows, but she acted in smaller ways. She sent food rations south, ensuring Mangaltai could stabilize the harvest. She sent copies of military decrees to border outposts in his name. She commissioned a shrine in his honor, not in Mukden, but in a village where he had once built a bridge during a flood. Peasants remembered that kind of leadership. It traveled in songs and stories, not in scrolls. But even as she acted, she felt the tide shifting. Hong Taiji grew louder. He began presenting proposals at court, plans for tax reform, land management, centralization of power. He wore the garments of the future, and more dangerously, he understood how to speak to the elders. He spoke not of himself, but of the nation. And when he bowed lower than necessary, because he knew power loved the appearance of humility. Lady Yehe Nara watched, and she understood. Her son was a candidate. Hong Taiji was a narrative. And in court, narratives often won. When Mangaltai returned briefly to Mukden to pay respects to the ailing Nurhaci, the moment became a quiet spectacle. The brothers stood in the great chamber, Daishan, Amin, Hong Taiji, and Mangaltai, lined like sentinels from 4 corners of an unraveling dream. Nurhaci, pale and thin, looked at them as if seeing the ghosts of his own choices. He said nothing of succession. He only said, "You will not bury each other before I am gone." But they all knew he would be gone soon. That night, Lady Yehe Nara walked the palace grounds beneath a sliver moon. She passed the willow trees she had planted decades earlier, now full-grown, their shadows long across the stone paths. She thought of Yehe, of the price she had paid, of the silence she had lived. And she made a decision. She called for Mangaltai. She told him to step back, not to surrender, but to wait. The court was not ready for a calm leader. It was ready for a storm. Let them choose a storm. Let them tire of it. Then when the dust settled, when the banners frayed, when the names carved into marble faded from praise into obligation, let the one who had not burned himself in the fire return to claim the ash. Mangaltai resisted, but he obeyed, and Lady Yehe Nara, for the first time in years, allowed herself a breath of relief, because the dynasty was not yet born. It was only being labored, and she, ever the willow, would not push the tree to bloom before its season. Power does not collapse with thunder. It unravels like silk pulled through flame, slowly, invisibly, until nothing remains but smoke. The final months of Nurhaci's reign were not marked by triumph, but by erosion. His victories had brought him an empire, but not peace. The banners he raised to unite the Yurkins had become walls between sons. The silence he used to command respect now only stirred speculation. And the women of the court, the mothers of princes, the architects of alliances, moved like ghosts through a house built on borrowed time. Lady Yehe Nara had seen it coming, but no foresight could prepare her for how it would feel. Nurhaci's decline began with a wound, a minor injury sustained in a skirmish against a remote Ming garrison. The court physicians said it was nothing, but it did not heal. Soon his sleep became troubled. He mumbled names of men long dead. He forgot the details of the laws he had once crafted with precision. His hands, once steady enough to hold a sword without tremble, now quivered even when pouring tea. By midsummer, the rumors were no longer whispers. He was dying, and the court knew it. They didn't say it. They didn't dare. But everything changed. Ministers stayed later at court meetings. Generals began gathering support. Eunuchs aligned themselves with factions. And in the deepest corners of the palace, where incense lingered and words traveled through glances, the question roared louder than any war drum. Who would rule after the tiger fell? The sons, Daishan, Amin, Mangaltai, and Hongtaiji, became the four winds pulling at a fraying tent. But the court did not divide evenly. Each prince held his own court within the court, his own spies, his own tailors, his own scribes and generals and lovers. And behind each son, a mother whispered carefully chosen words into carefully trained ears. Lady Yehe Nara whispered less now. Her influence, once woven into every corner of the palace, had become a thing of caution. Too much visibility would be fatal. She had seen what happened to the loud, so she moved like a specter, her silence a shield. But others had grown bolder. Yabahai no longer hid her ambition. She walked the halls as if they were already hers. She began speaking at court meetings, publicly, not through intermediaries. She donated rice to temples, sponsored the copying of sacred texts, and presented herself as the embodiment of Confucian virtue. And Hong Taiji, her son, matched her every move with the practiced grace of someone born for the throne. He hosted poetry readings for the court scholars. He held meetings with military captains without his father's consent. He even commissioned a new ancestral shrine, larger, more elaborate, near the northern gate of Mukden. It was said to honor the legacy of Nurhaci, but Lady Yehe Nara saw what it truly was, a monument to a beginning. A throne in all but name. Daishan, older and more cautious, focused on securing the treasury and military logistics. His moves were quiet but effective. Generals backed him, so did some key ministers. But his hesitation, his unwillingness to claim power outright, left a vacuum. Amin, impetuous and unpredictable, drifted between factions. Too rash to be king, too dangerous to ignore. And Mangaltai, he had withdrawn. At his mother's instruction, he had removed himself from the court's inner circle. Some said it was because he had no stomach for the game. Others called it wisdom. But in truth, it was neither. It was survival. Lady Yehe Nara had spent her life surviving. As a bride traded for peace, as a consort married to war, as a mother whose tribe had burned beneath her husband's banners. She had learned again and again that in a palace full of fire, it is not the brightest flame that lasts. It is the one that refuses to burn. Still, even she could not stop what came next. It began with a death. A minor concubine found drowned in the eastern pond. Then a general was poisoned, his tea laced with ground mercury. Then a steward disappeared. A scribe was caught copying military orders. A temple was defaced. Each event, isolated, was small, but together they painted the portrait of a court unraveling. And still, Nurhaci said nothing. He withdrew deeper into his private quarters, surrounded by shamans, servants, and silence. He refused most visitors. Even his sons were kept at a distance. Some said he had gone mad. Others said he was composing his final edict. Lady Yehe Nara did not try to see him. She knew he would not summon her. Not now. Not after everything. Not after Yehe. And so she waited. Then came the fire. It began in the western quarter, a storage building, nothing more. But the wind caught it. Flames leapt from beam to beam, devouring tapestries, records, grain stores, scrolls. The guards were slow to respond. Some said they had been sent away. Others claimed sabotage. But by morning, half the palace's administrative wing had burned. They called it an accident. Lady Yehe Nara did not believe in accidents. The records lost in that fire included key succession orders, logs of military command, treasury archives, and perhaps, intentionally, any document that might have weakened a certain prince's claim. Hong Taiji emerged from the chaos unscathed. His residence had not been touched. Neither had Abahai's. And when Nurhaci finally addressed the court, his voice thin, his body frail, he said only this: "You four share my burden, until heaven makes clear who may carry it alone." It was not a declaration, it was a deferral, a curse wrapped in tradition. The court bowed, the sun said nothing, but they all knew what it meant: no heir, no peace. And so the palace began to burn in a different way, not with fire but with fear. Loyalty was questioned, servants interrogated, horses went missing. Couriers were bribed, priests were followed, some wives refused to eat, some sons slept in armor. Lady Yehe Nara walked through it all like a ghost. She spent her days copying poems, watering her willows, sending small notes to minor officials, reminding them of forgotten kindnesses. She said nothing of the coming war. She only wrote one sentence in her journal that winter: "I married into fire. I raised a son in smoke. I will not bury him in ash." It was the only record she ever kept of that season, because in the burning court, memory was the only thing they could not erase. And history, true history, was not written in fire. It was remembered by those who survived it. Power does not collapse with thunder. It unravels like silk pulled through flame, slowly, invisibly, until nothing remains but smoke. The final months of Nurhaci's reign were not marked by triumph, but by erosion. His victories had brought him an empire, but not peace. The banners he raised to unite the Yurkins had become walls between sons. The silence he used to command respect now only stirred speculation. And the women of the court, the mothers of princes, the architects of alliances, moved like ghosts through a house built on borrowed time. Lady Yehe Nara had seen it coming, but no foresight could prepare her for how it would feel. Nurhaci's decline began with a wound, a minor injury sustained in a skirmish against a remote Ming garrison. The court physicians said it was nothing, but it did not heal. Soon his sleep became troubled. He mumbled names of men long dead. He forgot the details of the laws he had once crafted with precision. His hands, once steady enough to hold a sword without tremble, now quivered even when pouring tea. By midsummer, the rumors were no longer whispers. He was dying, and the court knew it. They didn't say it. They didn't dare. But everything changed. Ministers stayed later at court meetings. Generals began gathering support. Eunuchs aligned themselves with factions. And in the deepest corners of the palace, where incense lingered and words traveled through glances, the question roared louder than any war drum. Who would rule after the tiger fell? The sons, Daishan, Amin, Mangaltai, and Hong Taiji, became the four winds pulling at a fraying tent. But the court did not divide evenly. Each prince held his own court within the court, his own spies, his own tailors, his own scribes and generals and lovers. And behind each son, a mother whispered carefully chosen words into carefully trained ears. Lady Yehe Nara whispered less now. Her influence, once woven into every corner of the palace, had become a thing of caution. Too much visibility would be fatal. She had seen what happened to the loud, so she moved like a specter, her silence a shield. But others had grown bolder. Abahai no longer hid her ambition. She walked the halls as if they were already hers. She began speaking at court meetings, publicly, not through intermediaries. She donated rice to temples, sponsored the copying of sacred texts, and presented herself as the embodiment of Confucian virtue. And Hong Taiji, her son, matched her every move with the practiced grace of someone born for the throne. He hosted poetry readings for the court scholars. He held meetings with military captains without his father's consent. He even commissioned a new ancestral shrine, larger, more elaborate, near the northern gate of Mukden. It was said to honor the legacy of Nurhaci, but Lady Yehe Nara saw what it truly was: a monument to a beginning. A throne in all but name. Daishan, older and more cautious, focused on securing the treasury and military logistics. His moves were quiet but effective. Generals backed him, so did some key ministers. But his hesitation, his unwillingness to claim power outright, left a vacuum. Amin, impetuous and unpredictable, drifted between factions. Too rash to be king, too dangerous to ignore. And Mangaltai, he had withdrawn. At his mother's instruction, he had removed himself from the court's inner circle. Some said it was because he had no stomach for the game. Others called it wisdom. But in truth, it was neither. It was survival. Lady Yehe Nara had spent her life surviving. As a bride traded for peace, as a consort married to war, as a mother whose tribe had burned beneath her husband's banners, she had learned again and again that in a palace full of fire, it is not the brightest flame that lasts. It is the one that refuses to burn. Still, even she could not stop what came next. It began with a death. A minor concubine found drowned in the eastern pond. Then a general was poisoned, his tea laced with ground mercury. Then a steward disappeared. A scribe was caught copying military orders. A temple was defaced. Each event, isolated, was small, but together they painted the portrait of a court unraveling. And still, Nurhaci said nothing. He withdrew deeper into his private quarters, surrounded by shamans, servants, and silence. He refused most visitors. Even his sons were kept at a distance. Some said he had gone mad. Others said he was composing his final edict. Lady Yehe Nara did not try to see him. She knew he would not summon her. Not now. Not after everything. Not after Yehe. And so she waited. Then came the fire. It began in the western quarter, a storage building, nothing more. But the wind caught it. Flames leapt from beam to beam, devouring tapestries, records, grain stores, scrolls. The guards were slow to respond. Some said they had been sent away. Others claimed sabotage. But by morning, half the palace's administrative wing had burned. They called it an accident. Lady Yehe Nara did not believe in accidents. The records lost in that fire included key succession orders, logs of military command, treasury archives, and perhaps, intentionally, any document that might have weakened a certain prince's claim. Hong Taiji emerged from the chaos unscathed. His residence had not been touched. Neither had Abahai's. And when Nurhaci finally addressed the court, his voice thin, his body frail, he said only this: "You four share my burden, until heaven makes clear who may carry it alone." It was not a declaration, it was a deferral, a curse wrapped in tradition. The court bowed, the sun said nothing, but they all knew what it meant: no heir, no peace. And so the palace began to burn in a different way, not with fire, but with fear. Loyalty was questioned, servants interrogated, horses went missing. Couriers were bribed, priests were followed, some wives refused to eat, some sons slept in armor. Lady Yehe Nara walked through it all like a ghost. She spent her days copying poems, watering her willows, sending small notes to minor officials, reminding them of forgotten kindnesses. She said nothing of the coming war. She only wrote one sentence in her journal that winter: "I married into fire. I raised a son in smoke. I will not bury him in ash." It was the only record she ever kept of that season, because in the burning court, memory was the only thing they could not erase. And history, true history, was not written in fire. It was remembered by those who survived it. The tiger was gone, but the jungle remained. And in its heart, where whispers replaced war drums and silk cloaked sharper blades than steel ever could, Lady Yehe Nara lived on. Not as queen, not as mother of the next emperor, but as a widow in a palace that had no use for old memories. When Nurhaci died, the court mourned in appearance only. The ceremonies were grand: burning incense, pounding drums, parades of white-robed generals bowing to his spirit tablet. But beneath every bow was calculation. The true ritual was not for the dead, it was for the living. Hong Taiji had won. Without ever declaring himself emperor, without wearing a crown, he moved into the seat of power as effortlessly as smoke rises. Daishan supported him. Amin was contained. Mangaltai, her son, watched silently as the court bent not to tradition, but to momentum. Lady Yehe Nara felt the shift like a pressure in her bones. She had buried her tribe. She had buried her husband. Now she began burying her relevance. As the new regime settled into place, her position became ceremonial. The once feared Defujin, The consort of a conqueror and mother to a prince was now a relic. Her words were welcome but not sought. Her advice was honored but not followed. She was given a new residence, larger, quieter, farther from the center. It was meant as a gesture of respect. It was exile in silk, but she accepted it and smiled, because Lady Yehe Nara had never needed a throne to play the game. She had been playing it since she was a child, trading glances in council tents and learning the languages of power long before any man crowned himself king. A quiet court was a dangerous court, and Mukden had grown too quiet, so she began again. In the margins, she visited the younger concubines, not as a rival, but as a teacher. She instructed them in poetry, in ritual, in how to listen more than speak. She taught them which tea soothed nerves and which scent opened closed hearts. She asked them often about their children, not out of kindness, but to learn which bloodlines were rising. She read everything: edicts, rumors, temple registries, market prices. She noted who was being married off and to whom. She paid attention to which generals suddenly requested leave and which temples began receiving extra grain. Every movement was a message, and all the while she watched Hong Taiji remake the state in his image. He centralized the administration, reduced the power of the other princes, created a bureaucracy modeled after the Ming, Chinese in form, Eurasian in purpose. He commissioned scholars, he built temples, he renamed laws. He ruled with vision, but he ruled alone. Daishin remained loyal but distant. Amin fell out of favor after an unauthorized campaign. Mangaltai was pushed to the periphery, respected but ignored. Lady Yehe Nara did not protest. She told her son only once, "Let him burn the future. Ashes hold the shape of the fire that made them." Mangaltai, older now, wore a mask of detachment. He spoke little at court. He married again. He raised his children in the southern compound and spent his nights walking beneath pine trees rather than debating in chambers. To most he was finished, but not to her, because ashes still glow if you look closely. She kept a private ledger, names, movements, allegiances, a living map of court power. She called it the game board, not because she intended to win, but because knowing the players was more important than holding the dice. And then came the summons. A message from the inner court. The emperor, Hong Taiji now used the term without ceremony, requested her presence. It had been years. She entered the chamber with her usual grace. Her robes were plain but pristine, her hair braided in the old Yehe style, a silent reminder of the tribe no scroll dared mention. Hong Taiji stood at the window, gazing out at the city his father had built. When he turned, he did not bow. He smiled. "Do you still mourn him?" he asked. She paused. "Only the part of him that believed in building more than destroying." He nodded. "He left many ruins behind. I intend to raise towers." "Towers fall," she said, "not if the foundations are deep enough." They spoke for an hour, of succession, of governance, of history. He did not ask for her blessing. He wanted her silence. Her endorsement, spoken or not, and she gave it, not because she supported him, but because she saw the shape of something larger, a dynasty, not just a reign. When she left, she walked slower. Her heart, though steady, ached. Not from defeat, but from clarity. She would not see the end of this game, but she had played her part. And yet, her son still lived, which meant the game was not over. In the following weeks, she made quiet moves. She gifted a rare scroll to a young concubine, one recently favored by Hong Taiji. She invited the tutors of imperial children to her residence for tea. She offered land to a minor general whose wife had once been a Yehe servant. Each gesture was small. Each gesture was a seed. Because if the present could not be influenced, the future still could. She began writing. Not letters, not memoirs. She wrote stories. Parables about willows that bent but did not break. About fires that cleansed but could not erase. About rivers that changed names but never direction. She wrote for children, for grandchildren, for those yet born into palaces built on bones. And in her stories, she buried truths that history would forget. That dynasties are not built by men alone, that silence can be sharper than swords, that a widow's game never ends, It simply changes players. In her final winter in court, Lady Yehe Nara walked the outer walls one last time. Snow fell. The willows bowed beneath it, and in that soft, white hush she whispered, "Let them write his name in gold. I will write mine in memory." In the end, no monument bears her name, no title, no statue, no gilded shrine. Only the silence where her footsteps once fell, and the willows she planted that still bow in the wind long after the throne has changed hands. Lady Yehe Nara passed from this world not with a gasp, nor with a cry, but with the gentle exhale of someone who had held her breath too long. Her death was quiet, like everything else she had mastered, undramatic, unannounced, unmourned by those who held the pen of history. In the record books, she would be listed merely as a consort of Nurhaci, a footnote beside greater names. But those records are blind. They do not see the strings behind the curtain, the hands that held empires steady, the eyes that watched princes rise, not with joy but with warning, the heart that learned how to break again and again, without shattering. In the months before her death, she walked less. Her body weakened, though her mind remained sharp. She spent her days seated near the western garden, beneath the shade of the very willows she had planted decades earlier. They had grown tall now, strong-limbed and quietly defiant, just as she had always been. The younger concubines, now mothers themselves, came to her not for favor, but for guidance. The eunuchs served her with reverence, not because they feared her power, but because they knew, somehow, that they were witnessing the last breath of an older world. Her son, Mangaltai, came often. He brought no gifts, no scrolls, no declarations of loyalty, only conversation. Sometimes they spoke of his children, other times of poetry, or the strange way frost clung to the steps on certain mornings. They spoke like two people who had lived beyond ambition, beyond winning, beyond the court's games. But one day he came with news. Hong Taiji had declared the new name of the dynasty, Qing, not later Jin, not Yurchen, Qing, pure, clear, eternal. With it came changes, new laws, new titles, a deliberate and total reinvention of identity. Lady Yehe Nara listened, then closed her eyes. "It's done," she whispered. Her son hesitated. "What is?" "The erasure," she said, "of everything before." She was right. With the establishment of the Qing, Hong Taiji sealed the fate of the past. The banners remained, the armies marched. But the soul of the old world, of the tribes, the old marriages, the ancestral grudges and blood-forged promises, was buried beneath silk and ceremony. The empire had grown up, and like all children, it had forgotten its mother. But not entirely, because though Lady Yehe Nara's name was struck from official records, her influence lived in whispers. In the mannerisms of women she had trained, in the administrative style of Mangaltai, who never ruled but taught others how to, in the distant policies shaped by advisors who had once sat at her table, unsure of how much they owed her and too afraid to ask, even in Hong Taiji himself. He never thanked her, never praised her, never even mentioned her by name again. But he did visit her willows once, alone, after her death. He walked among them, silent, head uncovered despite the cold. A servant said he paused before the bench she used to favor, and bowed. History does not remember that. History does not want to. Because to remember her would be to admit that the Qing, a dynasty that would rule China for nearly 3 centuries, owed part of its existence to a woman without a title, a widow of a forgotten tribe, a consort who played no flute, led no army, held no seal. Only memory. Her funeral was small. She had requested it. No parade, no court mourning, only a cremation beneath the willows, her ashes scattered across the garden she had nurtured when no one watched. Mangaltai stood alone at the edge of the ceremony. He said nothing, because what could be said? She had outlived an empire and died invisible to the one that replaced it, but not entirely. Years later, a young imperial tutor would find a worn scroll in a locked box, parables written in an older script, marked with small brushstrokes of a hand that bore both discipline and tenderness. The stories were simple, but profound. Each ended with a single character, Liu, Willow. He asked no one of its origin, but he copied its lessons into his own teachings. And the next generation learned to listen. Because some trees outlive empires, some shadows teach more than crowns. And sometimes the most powerful force in the story is not the tiger who ruled it, but the willow who remembered.